The knock at my front door came at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning in November, hard and impersonal, the kind of knock that belongs to a stranger with authority and no apology for the hour. I opened it to find two men on my porch, one in an OPP uniform, the other in a dark jacket holding a clipboard, and behind them, parked in my own gravel drive with the engine still running, my son-in-law's black Mercedes, window down, his arm hanging out, phone raised, filming the whole thing. He caught my eye across the distance and grinned. "Time to go, old man," he called out. "We'll handle things from here." I looked at the officer. I looked at the clipboard. Then I asked one quiet question. The officer's expression changed completely. "My name is Stanley Morrow. I am 67 years old, a retired civil engineer, and for 31 years I have lived on 12 acres of lakefront property outside Barrie, Ontario, land I bought raw in the early 90s, cleared myself on weekends, and built a home on with my own hands. The property sits on the eastern shore of Lake Simcoe, and on a clear morning the water catches the light in a way that my late wife described, every single time, as a gift she hadn't earned. She passed 2 years ago this past September. The property is the last physical place in the world where I can still hear her voice. I was pouring the first cup of coffee of the morning when I heard the vehicles. 3 of them, rolling up my drive in a loose procession, an OPP cruiser, a dark blue pickup with a magnetic sign on the door I couldn't quite read from the kitchen window, and my son-in-law's Mercedes. I set the mug down on the pine counter, dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and went to the door. "Welcome to Chosen Vengeance. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this kind of story speaks to you, stay close. You'll want to hear how it ends." Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. When the people you've spent your whole life protecting turn on you, what's your first instinct? To confront them directly, or to go quiet, collect the evidence, and let the law do what it was built for? Tell me below. A quick note before we continue. Some details in this story have been adjusted for the sake of privacy, and any resemblance to specific individuals beyond my own family is coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. I knew the officer. His name was Constable Aldridge. A decent man, maybe 40, who'd come out twice before when I had trouble with ice fishermen, trespassing across the north boundary. He had the look that morning of someone who'd drawn a shift he didn't particularly want. He held a manila envelope at his side and wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Mr. Morrow," he said, his voice careful and formal. "I'm sorry to be here like this. We've received documentation indicating that this property has been transferred under a power of attorney to a numbered company, 2291847 Ontario Inc. I've been asked to facilitate a change of possession." He extended the envelope toward me. "There's also a property manager here to begin the transition." I took the envelope. I didn't open it immediately. I looked past Constable Aldridge's shoulder, across the gravel, at the dark blue pickup. A man in a down vest was standing beside it with a ring of keys in his hand, his eyes moving across the front of my home the way a person surveys something they've just bought, and behind him the Mercedes and my son-in-law still filming. "Pack light," he called out, his voice cutting through the cold morning air without effort. "Renovators come Monday, and we need the place cleared." He laughed at something, tilting the phone screen briefly toward the passenger seat. My daughter was sitting there. She didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead at the tree line, her arms folded across her chest, her face arranged into careful blankness. I had spent 31 years building things designed to hold. Bridges, mostly. Infrastructure engineered to carry weight without failing. You do not do that work for 3 decades without learning to read a structure before it gives, to locate the weakness before it finds you. Standing on my own porch that morning, holding papers drawn up to remove me from the only home I had left, I felt something I hadn't quite anticipated, a cold and complete stillness, because I already knew something they did not. I turned back to Constable Aldridge. I adjusted my glasses. "Before you go any further," I said, "I need to ask you one straightforward question." He gave a short nod. "This transfer was executed under a power of attorney for property. Is that correct?" "That's what the filing states, sir." "Then I need you to explain to me how a power of attorney can convey any authority over property that isn't held in the grantor's personal name. This land hasn't been in my name since 2019. It was placed into an inter vivos trust, a living trust, at that time. I am the income beneficiary and the designated occupant for my lifetime. A corporate fiduciary in Toronto holds the title as trustee. I have no personal authority to transfer, mortgage, or encumber this property, which means any power of attorney I signed cannot extend to it either. The document is void, and whoever helped file it either knew that, in which case they've committed fraud against a registered title, or they didn't, in which case they've been manipulated into participating in one. Either way, before you facilitate any change of possession, I'd strongly suggest confirming with the Ontario Land Registry whether there's a crime being committed here this morning, and by whom. The color left Constable Aldridge's face so quickly and so completely that I thought for a moment he might need to sit down. His hand drifted toward his radio without him seeming to notice. He looked at the envelope I was holding. He looked at me. Then he looked across the gravel at the Mercedes, where my son-in-law had stopped laughing and was watching us with an expression that had lost its confidence somewhere in the last 30 seconds. "Mr. Morrow," Aldridge said slowly, "if what you're telling me is accurate, the trust has been registered with the Ontario Land Registry since October 2019, I said. Call dispatch. Ask them to pull the title history on this parcel. You'll have your answer in under 2 minutes. He pressed his radio. I stood and waited. Across the gravel, the Mercedes window went up. To understand the full shape of what was done to me, you have to go back 10 months, to January, when the ground was frozen solid, and the lake was sitting under 2 feet of ice, and my son-in-law sat across my kitchen table with a bottle of Merlot I hadn't asked for, and a folder of documents he set down with the easy confidence of a man who'd rehearsed the gesture. He talked for nearly an hour. He cited real numbers, the Ontario probate fee schedule, the land transfer implications on a property of this size, the administrative delays a grieving family faces when an estate isn't properly structured. He spoke about protecting what I'd built, about avoiding the punishing cost of passing assets through a will without a management framework in place. The language was fluent, precise, and entirely convincing. He was 44 years old and ran a numbered holding company that developed short-term rental properties across southern Ontario. He knew how to construct an argument around a target. "What we're proposing is simple," he said, refilling his own glass. "A power of attorney for property. Standard document, notarized, fully legal in Ontario. It designates me as your attorney for property management in the event you're unable to act. Hospital stay, health event, anything unforeseen. Nothing transfers. Nothing changes hands. You go right on living here exactly as you always have. But if something happens, and we need to act quickly, we're not tied up in court for 18 months while the estate sits frozen." He paused. He let that sit. "Your daughter worries about you," he said. "She just doesn't say it well." I told him I would read the documents before signing anything. He hesitated, almost imperceptibly, almost nothing, and then slid the folder across the table. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." 2 days later, my daughter called. She was crying before I'd finished saying hello. Not the polished, composed version of herself she usually presented, but something rawer, her voice catching in a way I recognized from when she was a teenager, and something had genuinely frightened her. She told me she'd spoken to a cardiologist colleague who was concerned about the November incident. A brief episode, nothing serious, but logged. She said that without someone legally authorized to make decisions on my behalf, a sudden health event could become catastrophic. Delays, frozen accounts, decisions made by the court instead of family. She said she couldn't lose me the way she'd lost her mother. She said her mother's name 3 times in 10 minutes. Each time, it reached somewhere I couldn't fortify in time. I signed the power of attorney documents 2 weeks later. A notary came to my home, a quiet, slightly unkempt man who set his briefcase on my dining table with the efficiency of someone being paid by the outcome and not by the hour. I read the opening pages carefully. They described exactly what my son-in-law had laid out. Authority to manage, conditional on incapacity, temporary in scope, no ownership transfer. The language matched the conversation. There was nothing in what I read that alarmed me. I did not read every page of a 53-page document on a February afternoon, with a stranger's notary standing in my kitchen and my daughters crying, still echoing somewhere in the back of my chest. And that was the mistake. The single catastrophic failure in an otherwise sound structure, because buried in the middle of that stack, tucked among pages of substitute decision-making language and health directive boilerplate, was one document that had nothing to do with powers of attorney at all. It was a direction of transfer, a form authorizing the immediate conveyance of beneficial interest in the property to 2291847 Ontario Inc., my son-in-law's holding company. One signature, mine, witnessed by a complicit notary, was all it needed. I didn't discover it until 8 months later, on a mild September afternoon, when a man in a hard hat knocked on my back door and asked about access to the north fence line for a survey. He was polite and professional and apologetic for the intrusion. He explained he was conducting a topographical assessment on behalf of a private mortgage lender, a mortgage investment corporation based in Mississauga, who needed to confirm property boundaries before finalizing a construction loan. I asked him what construction. He looked at his tablet. He said the borrower was 2291847 Ontario Inc., and that the approved development plan called for the demolition of existing residential structures and the construction of a 12-unit short-term rental facility. Short-term rentals, on my wife's lake, on the land where she'd planted cedar trees along the south boundary, because she wanted something that would outlive us both. I thanked the surveyor for his time. I asked him to finish his work unimpeded. Then I walked back inside and stood in the kitchen for a very long time, looking at the photograph of my wife on the windowsill. The one from the summer we finished the back deck, her laughing at something I'd said, squinting into the afternoon sun. I am not a man who moves from emotion. I spent 3 decades being the person in the room who stayed level when the project was failing, who read the data without flinching when everyone else had started reacting. I made myself do that now. I went to the filing cabinet. I pulled out the documents signed in February. I read every single page, slowly, in order, with a desk lamp and a legal pad. By the time I reached page 31, I understood exactly what had been done. The rage came. I won't pretend otherwise. It moved through my chest in a hot physical wave and settled in my hands as a fine involuntary tremor. But I did not call my daughter. I did not drive the 80 kilometers to their house in Collingwood and put my fist through the door. Every instinct toward that kind of confrontation I shut down the same way I'd shut down panic on a job site when the formwork started to fail. You don't chase the emergency. You read the load path. You build the counter. The first call I made was to a land registry agent in Barrie. She confirmed it within the hour. A direction of transfer had been registered against the title the week after I signed the documents. The numbered company was now listed as the beneficial owner. My name appeared only as the current occupant. The second call I made was to the trust company in Toronto. I had established the Inter Vivos Trust in October of 2019, 3 weeks after my wife received her diagnosis. I did it quietly, with a small estate planning firm in Barrie that had no connection to anyone in our social circle. I transferred the property in full, not a management interest, not a partial claim, but the entire asset placed into the trust with a corporate trustee holding title. I retained the right to reside there for my lifetime. I could not sell it, mortgage it, or encumber it. And critically, neither could any attorney acting on my behalf, because the Power of Attorney Act in Ontario is explicit. An attorney can only act within the scope of the grantor's own legal authority. I had no personal authority over trust property. Therefore, nothing I signed in February could transfer it. The direction of transfer was a legal nullity. It was a claim to something that could never be delivered, built on a document that could never convey what it pretended to convey, filed by a man who had not done the one title search that would have revealed, in under 10 minutes, that the asset he was trying to steal had been untouchable for years. My son-in-law had walked into a private mortgage lender and presented a fraudulent beneficial ownership claim to secure $18 million in financing against property that was never his to pledge. In Canada, that is mortgage fraud under Section 380 of the Criminal Code. Maximum sentence, 14 years. I didn't feel relief when I understood the full scope of his error. What I felt was the quiet that comes at the end of a long calculation, when you've run the numbers twice and the structure holds. The protection hadn't been built in response to anything he'd done. It had been built 6 years ago, in grief, to honor a promise to my wife, to preserve the place she loved beyond anything we owned. That decision, made without any suspicion of what was coming, had rendered everything he'd executed worthless from the moment he signed his name. But knowing this privately was not the same as being able to prove it publicly, and more to the point. I needed to understand, without remaining doubt, the precise depth of my daughter's involvement. Was she a peripheral participant in her husband's scheme, or had she been the mechanism, the one who knew which wound to press and pressed it deliberately? I spent 4 days performing a careful deterioration. I called my daughter and let my voice wander mid-sentence. I mentioned the new kettle twice in one call. When she came by with groceries I hadn't asked for, I fumbled with the coffee maker and apologized for the confusion, and I watched her absorb it with a patience that felt entirely wrong. The patient, slightly flat effect of a person managing a situation rather than visiting a father. When she mentioned that her husband would be handling the estate administration going forward, she used the phrase with a weight she didn't bother to disguise. On the 5th day, I drove to Toronto and sat across a desk from a property litigation lawyer named Sylvana Briggs, who ran a small firm near King Street and had spent 20 years doing one thing: dismantling real estate fraud executed by people who believed their paperwork was airtight. I laid the documents in front of her. She read them without speaking. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at me with an expression that was not quite surprise. "They filed the direction of transfer with the land registry," she said. "That tells you they intended this to function as genuine collateral, not a private arrangement, and the MIC loan confirms they succeeded in getting a lender to accept it." She tapped the mortgage document. "Your son-in-law obtained $1.8 million in secured financing using a fraudulent beneficial ownership claim. This isn't a family dispute. This is a criminal matter." I told her I understood that. I told her what I needed. She mobilized a forensic title examiner and a private fraud investigator over the next 48 hours. By Thursday, she had reconstructed the complete sequence: the notary, the filing, the MIC application, the draw schedule, the numbered company's account structure. What she found in the dating of the documents was the detail that finally removed every last vestige of uncertainty I had been carrying. My son-in-law had begun laying the groundwork for this scheme 19 months before he appeared at my kitchen table with his wine and his PowerPoint logic about probate fees. He had incorporated the numbered company 19 months earlier. He had engaged the development partner 14 months earlier. He had approached the MIC lender with a preliminary inquiry 12 months earlier. The night he arrived at my door with manufactured concern and a folder of documents was not an improvisation. It was the final act of a production that had been in rehearsal for the better part of 2 years. My daughter had known. She had to have known. The crying, the specific timing of the calls, the invocation of her mother's name, none of it was spontaneous. It was the mechanism her husband had designed, and she had agreed to operate. I needed her voice confirming it. I purchased a small voice-activated recorder, the kind designed for legal field use, no larger than a matchbook, continuous transmission to a paired receiver. I called my daughter. I made my voice uncertain and thin. I told her my chest had been tight, and I wanted her to come for tea, just the two of us, so I wouldn't feel so alone in the house. She arrived 40 minutes later, with a grocery bag she set on the counter without unpacking. She stood in my kitchen and watched me fumble with the kettle, and when I spilled water across the pine counter, she cleaned it with the brisk efficiency of someone who has already mentally moved past the space. Past the kitchen, past the house, past the father standing uselessly in the middle of it. When she excused herself to use the bathroom, I crossed to her coat hanging on the peg by the door, the same peg she'd used since she was 12 years old, and slipped the recorder flat into the fleece lining of the inner pocket, flush against the seam, invisible to any ordinary search. She left 20 minutes later. The recording began transmitting from her coat pocket at 4:47 in the afternoon. By 7 p.m. I had everything I needed. I won't recount all of it. But I will tell you that what I heard, in my daughter's own voice, at the dinner table in their Collingwood kitchen, was a conversation about timing, about which week to initiate the formal possession request, about whether I had declined sufficiently that a challenge from me would read as confusion rather than competence, and whether the construction permits could be expedited to compress the window between possession and demolition. And near the end, my son-in-law said something that settled into my chest and has not moved since. He said that once the final MIC draw cleared, and the funds were structured through the holding accounts, it wouldn't matter what I knew or tried to do, because by the time any court date was set, the development would already be underway, and the money would be jurisdictionally inaccessible. He was not wrong about their speed, He was entirely wrong about what was already waiting for him. I gave the recordings to Sylvana Briggs on a Friday morning. She listened to all of it, made her notes, and then did something I had not anticipated. She picked up her phone and called her contact at the OPPP Financial Crimes Unit directly. She did not ask my permission before she dialed. She looked at me across the desk and said simply, "We're past negotiation. Are we agreed?" We were agreed. The morning they came to my door, I had been awake since before 5. I made a full pot of coffee, drank 2 cups on the back deck watching the light lift off the lake, and came inside and waited. I knew they were coming. Sylvana had given me the approximate window. What I hadn't known was that my son-in-law would come personally, would need to be there for it, would bring my daughter along, and film it from the gravel like a man expecting to collect a trophy. When I asked Constable Aldridge my question about the trust, when I watched the color drain from his face as the full implication settled, I felt no particular satisfaction. What I felt was the specific exhaustion that comes at the end of something long and heavy. The moment when the structure you've been holding finally transfers its load to the ground, and you can let go of it. Aldridge called dispatch. He was on the radio for 4 minutes. When he came back, he did not mention the change of possession. He mentioned that he would need my son-in-law to remain on site pending further verification. Across the gravel, the Mercedes window went up. I went inside. I left the door open. From the kitchen window, I watched Constable Aldridge walk toward the car, watched my son-in-law lower the window with deliberate slowness and begin speaking with the expansive gestures of a man explaining something that shouldn't require explanation. I watched the moment that changed, when Aldridge's posture shifted from deferential to controlled, when the conversation stopped being an explanation and became something else entirely. I turned from the window and poured my 3rd cup of coffee. Sylvana arrived 20 minutes after that. Behind her came 2 vehicles from the OPP Financial Crimes Unit, plain dark sedans, no lights, no theater. The investigators were quiet and unhurried. They reviewed the documentation, spoke with Constable Aldridge, and then walked across the gravel toward the Mercedes. I watched through the glass. My son-in-law got out of the car with the posture of a man expecting to resolve a misunderstanding quickly. That posture lasted approximately 80 seconds. My daughter got out from the passenger side. She stood with her arms at her sides, not folded anymore, not composed, and when one of the investigators approached her, she looked toward the house, toward me, standing in my kitchen window with a coffee mug in my hand. I didn't move. I didn't change my expression. I just held her gaze and let her see what I needed her to see. That I had known for a long time, that the confused, declining old man she had planned to leave behind in a provincial care facility had been watching them the entire time. She looked away first. There was no dramatic scene in the driveway. There was the quiet, grinding formality of people who are very good at their work, the cautioning, the documentation, the precise and unhurried language of investigators who have done this before. My son-in-law asked for a lawyer. My daughter said nothing at all. Sylvana came to the door after they'd gone. She told me the OPP file was being forwarded to the Crown Prosecutor's office, that the MIC lender had already been notified and had frozen the outstanding loan proceeds pending the fraud investigation, and that the numbered company's accounts had been flagged under the proceeds of crime provisions. The full draw had not yet cleared. A significant portion of the $1.8 million was recoverable. "What happens to the property?" I asked. She looked at me with the patience of someone who'd already answered this question in her head several times over. "Nothing happens to it," she said. "It was never at risk. The trust held." I thanked her. She shook my hand and walked back down the porch steps and got in her car. I stood on the porch for a moment after she left. On the porch I'd built, looking out at the lane of cedar trees along the south boundary, the ones my wife had insisted on planting the first spring, because she said she wanted something that would still be standing long after we weren't. They were 12 feet tall now. They'd been saplings in a nursery truck on a Saturday in May when we were 42 years old and didn't yet know what was coming for us. My daughter called that evening from an unfamiliar number. I let it ring. She left a voicemail. I listened to it once, standing in the hallway with my coat still on, having just come in from the dock. She cried through most of it. Genuine this time, without architecture, without the precise calibration of the calls I'd received in January. She said she was sorry. She said it had gone further than she'd intended. She said her husband had told her it was restructuring, that I would never know the difference, that no real harm was being done to anyone. She said she loved me. I stood in the hallway and listened to every word of it. Then I set the phone on the hall table and went to make dinner. There is a version of this story in which a father finds a way to separate his child from the person who led her there. I have turned that version over many times in the weeks since, looking for the place where they become separable. I haven't found it. What my daughter chose to do with the memory of her mother, the way she deployed it, the timing of it, the surgical precision with which she applied it, is not something her husband manufactured in her. He may have provided the framework. He did not provide the willingness. The criminal proceedings are ongoing. I won't speculate about outcomes. What I can tell you is that the property is intact. The trust is intact. On clear mornings, the lake still catches the light exactly the way it always has. Last week, I took the canoe out before sunrise for the first time since my wife died. I paddled out to the middle of the bay and sat there in the dark, watching the horizon move from gray to rose to the pale, particular gold of a November morning on Lake Simcoe. The cedar trees along the south boundary were just visible from the water, dark shapes against the brightening sky, standing exactly where she'd wanted them to stand. She was right about those trees. They were already here long after she wasn't. And they will be here long after whatever comes next. I paddled back in. I tied up the canoe. I went inside and made the coffee. Some things, once you've built them right, don't come down easily.